Welcome to the debate. Today we are wrestling with a tension that's really as old as organized creative endeavor itself. The necessary dedication to technical mastery versus, well, the intentional rejection of that craft, often labeled de-skilling or maybe just taking shortcuts. Both are recognized in the source material as highly effective and, crucially, intentional artistic approaches serving very distinct goals. The central question before us is this: does the efficacy of contemporary art and music ultimately rest upon a foundation of traditional, dedicated skill? Or does the intentional reliance on concept, spontaneity, and technology provide an equally rigorous and valid path to creative success? My position is clear: dedicated skill and rigorous practice are fundamentally necessary. They form the bedrock for complex realization, for comprehensive creative range, and importantly, for those crucial cognitive and even spiritual benefits that enrich both the artist and the work itself.
And I come at it from a slightly different angle. While I absolutely respect the commitment to traditional craft, who wouldn't? I argue that de-skilling, shortcuts, conceptual rigor, these are equally valid paths. In fact, in contemporary contexts like postmodernism, the focus often shifts quite decisively from the manual skill, the hand, if you will, to the intellect and the exhibition of the idea itself. And in that context, traditional skill can sometimes seem redundant, maybe even counterproductive to the actual artistic goal.
Skill, though, in the purest sense, it's the essential prerequisite for complex, original, and deeply engaged art creation. It isn't just about some raw talent. It's the result of dedicated study and practice over time. We really have to consider the sheer neurological reality here. The human brain, it's slow in integrating new motor skills. It's a process which necessitates years of repetition, not only to acquire the skill, but also, and this is key, rigorous maintenance practice to prevent those neural pathways from, fading away or plateauing. Beyond the technical necessity of just being fluent, mastery provides a unique set of cognitive and, I'd argue, even spiritual rewards. Hands-on engagement gives you that crucial tactile connection essential for, as our source material puts it, keeping the brain wiring in good order. That focused, sustained effort, it can be an activator of spirituality.
Look, if you lack skill, you fundamentally lack the foundation needed to realize complex or truly original ideas. You simply cannot coherently write classical music or complex jazz improvisation without a deep knowledge of music theory. Your ability to write for traditional instruments or orchestras is severely limited because you just don't grasp their mechanics, their history, their nuances. Ultimately, skill is what allows the artist to move past the analytical stage, what we might call the Apollonian knowledge phase, to achieve that fluid, intuitive, almost Dionysian performance style, where execution becomes spontaneous, happening without constant real-time analysis.
Okay, that's a powerful case for the intrinsic value of practice, especially the cognitive and spiritual dimensions you mention. However, artistic value can also be derived entirely from the intellectual concept or from raw expression or even the strategic use of constraints. And this is precisely why traditional craft skills might become less relevant or, as I said, even detrimental to certain forms of artistic expression. My core claim really is that de-skilling is pretty foundational to postmodernism. It shifts the rigor entirely away from traditional craft and towards the intellect. Conceptual art, for example, maintains its rigor even if the manual skill involved is minimal, because the difficulty, the challenge, is found in the idea, its structure, and how it's presented or exhibited. We see this widely in forms like pop music, right? Technical ability is often secondary to immediate artistic expression, sincerity, maybe even just attitude.
Early rock and roll, for instance, often employed, non-linear approaches that arguably provided a creative shortcut to extrinsic rewards very quickly. It proves that shortcuts can be, and often are, highly effective artistic paths. And we also have to value imperfection sometimes. Untrained artists can often cut to the chase, so to speak, with a minimum of effort. The errors or the perceived imperfections inherent in de-skilled work can create a unique, sometimes profound charm.
It aligns with this idea that art can arise from happy accidents during experimentation.
Historically, you look at artists like Andy Warhol, who wasn't exactly known for his manual draftsmanship, right? He utilized sheer cunning, strategy, delegation to achieve his results. This strategic approach, which today might use technology, say generative AI, music, as a modern form of Dada or avant-garde art, well, that's equally rigorous in its intellectual demands.
I see why you emphasize that shift, the shift in rigor to the conceptual plane. But let me challenge your definition of rigor, specifically when we consider execution. You claim the idea itself is the source of rigor. Fair or not? Yet, intellectual rigor alone simply cannot compensate for the inability to execute complex forms. Mastery allows a musician, for example, to work rigorously and see music from multiple angles, to translate human creative logic coherently into something intricate, something layered. That fluency in music theory, even when playing what sounds like wild freeform jazz, is precisely what enables the underlying structure and coherency. The constraints you mention, well, are they really choices if they're born merely from incapacity, from not being able to do it otherwise?
That's a good point about fluency, but I think maybe you're conflating the rigor of creation with the rigor of realization. For true conceptual art, the difficulty lies almost entirely in the intellectual structure, the concept itself, and the often significant difficulty of exhibiting that idea powerfully and clearly. For that specific artistic goal, those years of manual practice might simply be unnecessary. The rigor is in the cognitive labor of structuring the idea. That's what we're trying to achieve, often in an environment that really values novelty and concept, perhaps more than pure craft these days.
Okay, I acknowledge that conceptual rigor exists, absolutely. But what happens when the idea itself demands complexity that the artist simply cannot handle? For example, if a conceptual artist wants to write a piece for a large, complex ensemble, say an orchestra, the absence of deep musical skill becomes a severe limitation, doesn't it? Those constraints then become roadblocks, not really leverageable artistic choices. If they can't grasp the logic of the instruments, the interaction, the harmony, the resulting work is inevitably constrained by their limitations, not enhanced by some strategic artistic decision.
But doesn't that assume complexity is always the highest measure of artistic success? Sometimes the power is in the reduction, or the constraint itself becomes the very engine of creativity.
I agree with that in part, sure. Constraints can be powerful. But let's transition that idea to the modern environment. If constraints are the engine, then technology, it seems, must be the fuel, because technology appears to offer the ultimate shortcut around skill, doesn't it?
Precisely. And this leads us directly to the role of technology and its ability to, in a way, level the playing field. New tools, specifically things like generative AI, offer what you might call a crucial shortcut to aptitude. This technology requires almost no manual execution skill for content generation, at least on the surface. And it serves as a vital access point for new artists. For those perhaps with little traditional musical skill, making sophisticated soundscapes or even pop songs with computers can be deeply enriching. The rigor shifts, you see, from the finger to the prompt, maybe, from the hand to the curated software environment.
I'm still not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning, especially regarding depth. Relying so heavily on technology seems to bypass the very cognitive and spiritual benefits we know, or at least strongly suspect, are derived from manual hands-on practice. We have significant evidence suggesting that engagement in manual craft is somehow more spiritually rewarding than merely generating ideas or using tools as intermediaries. When creativity becomes a matter of pure convenience, a reliance on a machine to do the heavy lifting of execution, don't we risk diluting the depth that comes from the commitment, the struggle required for traditional skill development? Is convenience in creativity inherently, lacking in value compared to that deep commitment?
I think we need to look at what the new commitment is, though. Perhaps the required skill set is just changing, evolving, not disappearing altogether. The source material actually introduces the concept of curation here. And maybe that's the new skill. While AI might remove the manual labor of execution, the ability to select, synthesize, and refine those generated results, that requires an eye or an ear. It's a combination of skill and talent, just applied differently.
Wait, before we move on, you mentioned level 4 earlier in passing. Could you just define for us what that actually means? because that term feels a bit like dense jargon that could use some unpacking for clarity.
Ah, fair challenge, yes. When we talk about level 4 purely conceptual audio art, we're generally referencing the use of technology to realize sophisticated sound art that really has zero reliance on traditional instrumental skill. None at all. The focus is entirely on the concept, and it's often facilitated by software, algorithms, processing, that kind of thing. This is where you might see the rise of the musicist, as some call it, someone who focuses on adapting creative activities through software and technology, rather than primarily through performing on a traditional instrument. Their skill lies in engineering the sound concept, manipulating the tech, not necessarily executing notes in the traditional sense.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. But even if we accept the skill of this musicist in curation, it doesn't seem to replace the foundational understanding that mastery provides. The skilled musician curates based on an intimate knowledge of timbre, dynamics, harmony, history, theory. The unskilled user perhaps curates based mainly on taste, which feels like a different level of rigor entirely.
Not necessarily different, maybe just differently applied. The idea of curation as skill is powerful precisely because it acknowledges that strategic thinking and aesthetic judgment, taste, if you like, are rigorous in their own right. The musicist is selecting the parameters, guiding the process, choosing the outcomes that matter artistically within that technological framework.
Okay, let's circle back then to intuition, because that seems to be the end goal of practice for many artists. True artistic intuition, I'd argue, is a product of mastery. The ability to perform intuitively precisely because the analytical knowledge is preloaded, baked in through years of developing skill. This achieved fluency is surely superior to the approach of merely, banging on an instrument and hoping for the best. Intentionality that arises from mastery feels qualitatively different from a so-called happy accident.
But the happy accident is often intentional in de-skilled work, or at least the conditions for it are intentionally created. The effectiveness of de-skilling often lies in the strategic, intentional embrace of errors, limitations, or unexpected outcomes. Constraints, whether they're due to lack of skill or lack of resources, often lead to genuine creative breakthroughs. You talked about the Apollonian-Dionysian split earlier. Well, de-skilling can sometimes provide a direct shortcut to that Dionysian raw expression without necessarily needing all the intervening years of Apollonian study. Look at early rock and roll again. That raw, often technically simple, untrained expression achieved profound impact very quickly. This suggests at least that efficacy doesn't strictly or solely follow years of committed practice.
Cunning, and the leveraging of limitations, the strategic use of a bad guitar sound or a super simple chord progression, that can be just as rigorous in its application as dedicated daily practice, provided the conceptual frame is strong and intentional.
While I fully agree that limitations can be utilized creatively, that's certainly a hallmark of many great artists, I still maintain that dedicated skill provides the widest creative range and, crucially, the deepest cognitive and spiritual connection to the material. Skill acts as the indispensable foundation necessary to execute complex or truly original ideas fully. If the idea itself requires complexity, like, as I said, writing a symphony, or designing a complex building, or creating intricate dance choreography, the skill simply must be there, and it must be maintained through rigorous practice, or the idea ultimately remains unrealized or only partially realized.
Conversely, I'd argue that artistic efficacy is achieved when the work is driven by strong intentions, powerful ideas, and sincerity, regardless of where that work falls on the axis between, say, traditional level 1 basics and that purely conceptual level 4 audio art we discussed. The value can lie entirely in the idea and the strategic use of available tools and constraints, even if those tools and constraints function as shortcuts. We have to accept, I think, that both minimal skill approaches and highly skilled approaches can be profoundly effective, depending entirely on the artist's goal and the medium's current capabilities. The rigor is simply, it's repositioned.
And that leaves us, as often happens, with this ongoing and, I think, fruitful tension. We can certainly recognize the value on both sides, the focused pursuit of technical skill and the ambition of conceptual art that leverages technology and constraints. Dedicated practice grants breadth and depth, particularly, I believe, those cognitive and spiritual rewards we touched upon.
While the embrace of concept and technology grants access, perhaps democratization, and allows for immediate, sometimes very powerful realization of ideas where extensive manual labor just isn't necessary or even desired, the most effective approaches, arguably, often involve some kind of integration or at least a strategic choice between these two methods. It really prompts the listener, doesn't it, to decide for themselves how they value practice versus pure concept in today's creative landscape.
Indeed. And we've certainly established that there is more to explore in this material, especially regarding the shifting definition of skill itself as technology continues its relentless evolution.